Welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be looking at interracial marriage trends
Okay.
in the U.S. and
Sounds good.
we got some research papers and Pew Research Center reports
Oh, wow.
ready to go. And this is not just a dry statistics rundown.
Right.
This is about understanding the evolving fabric of American society.
Absolutely. I think interracial marriage is a fantastic window into how societal norms,
Right.
cultural attitudes, and even demographics are shifting. So,
And get this. Back in 1967, only 3% of newlyweds were intermarried.
wow.
By 2015, that number jumped to a whopping 17%.
Huge.
It's a pretty big leap.
It is, yeah. And it really speaks volumes about the growing acceptance of interracial relationships.
Right.
But the story is far from simple. There are hidden patterns, surprising disparities,
Okay.
and a whole lot of nuance beneath the surface.
Let's unpack this. First things first. What's the overall trend we're seeing?
Yeah.
Is interracial marriage steadily on the rise across the board?
The short answer is yes. Since that landmark decision to overturn miscegenation laws in 1967, interracial marriage rates have been climbing consistently.
Got it.
In 2015, 17% of newlyweds, that's 1 in 6 couples tying the knot, were in interracial marriages.
Wow.
And if you look at all married people, that number sits at 10%, which translates to roughly 11 million Americans.
11 million people. That really paints a picture of a changing social landscape.
Yeah.
It's a far cry from the 230,000 intermarried newlyweds back in 1980.
Exactly. We've seen almost a tripling of that number by 2015. So yes, the trend is definitely upward.
Okay.
However, it's not uniform across all racial and ethnic groups. That's where things get interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of the variations we're seeing?
Well, for instance, intermarriage rates have significantly increased among Black and white newlyweds.
Huh.
But for Hispanics, rates have remained relatively stable. And here's the real head-scratcher. They've actually decreased for Asians.
Wait, seriously? I'm surprised to hear that, especially since Asians and Hispanics are often perceived as having high intermarriage rates.
That perception isn't entirely wrong. Asians and Hispanics still have the highest overall intermarriage rates
Okay.
compared to other groups. But their growth has plateaued or even dipped in recent years.
So what's going on here? Why this difference in trends?
One key factor is the changing demographics of the United States.
Okay.
The Hispanic and Asian populations have been growing rapidly, and that has a direct impact on what sociologists call the marriage market.
Marriage market. Okay, I need a little ELI 5 on that one.
Imagine it like this. The larger a racial or ethnic group becomes, the more likely its members are to marry within their own group, simply because there are more potential partners who share their background. It's a matter of probability and opportunity.
So as the Hispanic and Asian populations expand, they're creating larger pools of potential partners within their own communities, which could explain why their intermarriage rates aren't skyrocketing like those of Black and white couples.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But demographics are just one piece of the puzzle. When you add gender to the mix,
Oh, I bet.
things get even more fascinating.
Let's dive into that gender divide.
Yeah.
What's the research telling us?
Well, one striking finding is that Black men are twice as likely to be intermarried as Black women.
That raises a lot of questions. Is this about societal pressures, cultural norms?
Yeah.
Or maybe even something like hypergamy, where people tend to marry up
Right.
in terms of social status?
All of those factors likely play a role, but it's important to avoid jumping to conclusions or perpetuating stereotypes.
True.
Remember, we're just observing patterns here, not making judgments.
You're right. It's easy to fall into that trap. Okay. What other gender differences are we seeing?
Another interesting finding is that Asian women are far more likely to marry outside their race than Asian men,
Okay.
particularly those with lower education levels.
So we've got gender and education possibly influencing intermarriage rates. This is starting to feel like a complex social puzzle.
It is. And the more pieces we uncover, the more we learn about the intricate dynamics at play. Speaking of education, it turns out that intermarriage is slightly more common among college-educated folks across the board.
That's interesting. So does higher education directly lead to more interracial relationships, or are there other factors involved?
It's probably a combination of factors. Higher education might foster greater tolerance and understanding of different cultures. It also brings people from diverse backgrounds together, increasing the chances of interracial relationships forming.
Okay.
But we can't ignore the possibility of other variables influencing this trend.
Like what?
Well, take the striking difference among Hispanics, for example. A whopping 46% of Hispanic newlyweds with a bachelor's degree are intermarried.
Wow.
Compared to just 16% of those with a high school diploma or less.
Oh, that's a significant difference. It makes you wonder what's happening within the Hispanic community that might explain this disparity. Is it purely about education level, or are there other social or cultural factors at play?
That's a great question, and it's something researchers are still exploring. But it highlights the complexity of these trends and reminds us that there are many layers to unravel.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we've only just scratched the surface. This is getting really interesting, and I can't wait to dig deeper. What else do the sources reveal about the nuances of interracial marriage in the U.S.?
Okay.
So far, we've seen that, interracial marriage is on the rise, but the trends aren't uniform across different racial and ethnic groups.
Right.
And then there's that fascinating gender divide, with Black men and Asian women being more likely to marry outside their race. Plus, education level seems to play a role, too.
Yeah.
What else are we learning from these sources?
Well, now we're getting into the realm of social perceptions and how they can impact interracial couples.
You're talking about biases and societal expectations.
Exactly. The research introduces this fascinating concept called dyadic prejudice.
Dyadic prejudice. That sounds pretty intense. Break it down for me.
It's actually a pretty simple idea. It refers to prejudice directed not at individuals, but at the interracial couple as a unit. It's about how society views and judges the partnership itself, not just the individuals within it.
Okay, so it's not just about individual biases, but about the stigma attached to the relationship itself. That's heavy.
It is. And some couples face this kind of prejudice more acutely than others. For example, a Stanford study found that white women in interracial relationships, particularly those with Black men, often experience social penalties.
Social penalties. What does that look like in real life?
It can range from subtle things like disapproving stares or being excluded from social gatherings to more overt forms of discrimination. The study found that these women are often perceived as lower status and more likely to defy traditional gender roles.
That's really eye-opening. It makes you think about all the unspoken rules and expectations that exist within society, especially when it comes to race and relationships.
Yeah, it's almost as if there's an unwritten rule that white women should maintain racial boundaries, and stepping outside those lines carries consequences.
It's also interesting that the study found Black women, while often perceived as lower status overall, don't necessarily experience additional penalties for being in interracial relationships.
That's right. And it speaks to the complexity of these social judgments. It's just that different racial groups navigate these boundaries and expectations in distinct ways.
So much to unpack here. It makes you wonder, how do individual beliefs and worldviews factor into all of this? Do they shape how people view and react to interracial couples?
That's a great question, and it leads us to the concept of racial ethnic worldviews, or REWs for short.
Okay.
Think of them as lenses through which individuals view race and ethnicity.
Okay, so different REWs might lead to different opinions about interracial marriage.
Precisely. Research suggests that white individuals are less likely to hold what's called a multiculturalist achieved REW.
Multiculturalist achieved. I'm not familiar with that term. What does it mean?
It's a worldview that embraces and values diversity, seeing the blending of cultures as a positive thing.
So someone with this worldview was likely be more accepting of interracial relationships.
Exactly. But as I mentioned, white individuals are less likely to hold this particular REW. Instead, they're more likely to have a colorblind foreclosed worldview.
Okay, colorblind foreclosed sounds a bit like shutting down any conversation about race. Can you explain what that means?
Think of it as a worldview that downplays the role of race and ethnicity, often to the point of ignoring the realities of racial inequality and the value of cultural differences. It's like saying, I don't see color, but in a way that dismisses the very real experiences of people of color.
I see. So someone with this worldview might think they're being progressive by not seeing race, but they're actually ignoring important issues and experiences. And that could potentially impact their views on interracial relationships.
That's right. It can lead to a sort of denial of the social and cultural factors that shape how people view race and relationships. And according to the research, these worldviews can contribute to the persistence of racial boundaries and social stigma, influencing how people perceive and react to interracial couples.
This is all so fascinating. It's like we're peeling back the layers of a complex onion, uncovering all these hidden influences and perspectives. What else have you found in the research?
One of the key takeaways is that acceptance of interracial relationships is often tied to a deeper understanding of the historical and ongoing struggles faced by people of color.
So it's not enough to simply say, I'm not racist or I don't see color.
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging and understanding the systemic issues that still exist.
Exactly. And that awareness can influence how individuals perceive and interact with interracial couples.
It sounds like there's a connection between education and REWZs. The more educated someone is, the more likely they are to have a multiculturalist achieved worldview and be more accepting of interracial relationships.
There's definitely a correlation there, but we can't say for sure that education directly causes a shift in worldviews. It's more nuanced than that. However, what we can say is that education can expose people to different cultures and perspectives, which might contribute to a broader understanding of race and relationships.
So it's not just about the level of education, but the type of education and the experiences that come with it.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It's not just about acquiring knowledge, but about developing empathy and understanding.
This has been incredibly insightful. It's clear that interracial marriage is so much more than just a statistic. It's a reflection of broader societal trends, ingrained biases, and evolving cultural attitudes. What else can we glean from the research?
Well, one important takeaway is that while interracial marriage is becoming more common, it's not necessarily a sign that we've achieved a post-racial society.
I was just thinking that. It's easy to look at rising intermarriage rates and assume that racism is a thing of the past.
Right.
But as we've seen, there's still so many layers of prejudice and discrimination that interracial couples face.
Absolutely. And we can't forget that the fight for racial equality is far from over.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What's the big picture here? So we've uncovered a lot in this deep dive. Interracial marriage in the U.S. is definitely on the rise, but it's a complex landscape, shaped by demographics, social perceptions, and even individual worldviews. What's the big takeaway for our listeners? What's the key message they should walk away with?
I think the most important takeaway is that while interracial marriage is becoming more common, it doesn't mean we've achieved a post-racial society. There's still work to be done.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
Yeah.
It's easy to look at the numbers and think, hey, things are getting better, right? But as we've seen, there are still biases and prejudices that interracial couples face.
Exactly. We need to be mindful of those hidden layers of prejudice, like that dyadic prejudice we discussed earlier. And we need to be aware of how our own worldviews might influence our perceptions of interracial relationships.
Right? That whole colorblind, foreclosed worldview can be tricky, It sounds progressive on the surface, but it can actually perpetuate inequalities by ignoring the lived experiences of people of color.
Absolutely. We need to move beyond simply saying, I don't see color, and instead actively engage with issues of race and inequality. We need to educate ourselves and challenge our own biases.
And that's a process, right? It's not a one-time thing, but an ongoing effort to be more aware and more understanding.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all have biases and then actively working to unlearn them. It's about being open to different perspectives and experiences.
And it's about creating a society where everyone feels accepted and valued, regardless of their race or ethnicity.
Right. Absolutely. Interracial marriage is just one piece of that larger puzzle. But it's a fascinating and important piece that reveals a lot about where we are as a society and where we need to go.
So as the demographics of the U.S. continue to shift and evolve, what do you think the future holds for interracial marriage? Any predictions?
It's hard to say for certain, but I'm cautiously optimistic. I think as younger generations who are generally more open-minded and accepting of diversity become the majority, we'll likely see even greater acceptance of interracial relationships.
I hope you're right. But as we've discussed, it's not just about changing attitudes. It's also about addressing systemic issues and creating a more equitable society overall.
That's the key. It's not enough to simply tolerate difference. We need to actively celebrate and embrace it.
Well said. It's been an incredibly enlightening deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about a topic I thought I already understood.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, this is just a starting point. There's always more to learn and explore.
Exactly. And for our listeners who want to continue this journey, we've got a ton of resources in the show notes. Check them out, do some more digging, and keep those conversations going.
And most importantly, keep challenging your own assumptions and biases. That's how we create real change.
Couldn't agree more. And that's a wrap on our deep dives into interracial marriage trends in the U.S. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.